right. You got flowers?
And there's some, and it won't stay pretty, so we might have to enjoy them another week.
Use them. Well, looks like we are to the fifth week, or the lesson 5 of our quarterly. And this one here is titled "Miracles Around the Lake." So we will get started, and I'll have a word of prayer, and we'll go from there. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the blessings of this week that you have kept us safe and brought us back together. Lord, we just ask now that you would be with us as we continue to study the book of Mark and learn more of your word and how you are able to heal and lead your followers at that time. Willing to lead your followers today's world. Lord, I just ask you to watch over some protection. So, I have never been over to the Sea of Galilee. I don't know if y'all have ever been or not.
I actually have crossed the Galilee
Okay.
fishing boat.
Was it nice?
Yeah, I mean it was quite a long trip.
Yeah.
No storm came up.
Yeah, a storm came up.
No storm came up.
Well, I have heard that the lake is actually 13 miles long and 8 miles wide.
Yeah, the lesson brings that out. Yeah.
Okay. So, Gerald, come sit with us if you want to. No need to sit in the back of the class.
12 seats to choose from. Yeah, come sit. Bring
There you
yourself
go.
a microphone.
But this one here, talking about the Sea of Galilee, and miracles around the lake, and if we go back to Mark chapter 4, and start at verses 35, and that's where on that day when the evening came, he said to them, "Let's go over to the other side." After dismissing the crowd, took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. Now, there's other places where Jesus is saying to the disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Is there something different that is there more there than just getting in and going over to the other side of the lake? Is there something there other than that?
Jesus was always trying to broaden his ministry. So it wasn't just, well, let's go over there. He was going over there, I think, for a purpose, and that is to broaden his ministry beyond just the west side of Galilee. He wanted to go to the east side, which, of course, was an indication that he was, shall we say, fulfilling the work of the Messiah, because when you read the Old Testament, you see that it says God's people were continually to reach the Gentiles. And of course, on the east side of the lake was Decapolis, which is 10 cities of the Gentiles. So I think he was always in the process of broadening his ministry.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think he was, let's go over to the other side. I mean, go over where these other folks are at. Let's engage them. And so, anyway, as they get on the boat and they take off across the sea, it comes up a storm, and Jesus is tired, and he lays down in the front of the boat there, and he goes to sleep. And those that are with him, they're like, wake up. Do you not care? And that we're about to perish? And, Jesus, he says, and he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, hush, be still. And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? And so, I guess I'm getting kind of away from the lesson here, but I'm curious as to why. Well, Jesus said, why are you afraid? And I guess that's human nature. If you're out in the middle of the ocean or a big lake or whatever it is, to be afraid. But then he asked him, he said, do you still have no faith? What was he actually asking them whenever he was asking them, do you not have any faith? I don't.
When you read the Bible, at first you may think you understand what the thesis of the statement is. This was a physical storm, and their only hope was making it back shore. Okay? They were afraid for their lives. How many times in our life have we had emotional, or a physical storm that's affecting us? Not a storm like we had this. But if he can calm the waters, he can also calm where we are at emotionally, physically, and financially.
And I don't know how you mentioned the storm this week, and I don't know how it was where everybody else was at, but on Tuesday afternoon when I got home, everything was fine. And so I've got some honeybees, and so anyway, I was out working with those honeybees. And so Debbie came over, and she was helping me with some stuff there. And all of a sudden, the wind picked up, and I told her, I said, I heard a tree cracking. I said, you better get back in the house. She took off to the house, and I'm trying to get the top put back on this beehive. And then all of a sudden, it just, the wind was already picking up, and I'm trying to get this on, and there was a limb. Well, it wasn't a limb. It was the top of a tree. It twisted out right above me, and it fell about from here to Roy from me. And I'm trying to get away from there, and here come another one, and it fell even closer to where I was at. And I got back down to the house, or and I was standing, I didn't go in the house, I was just standing at the end of the house, kind of under the eave, out of the rain, and I done some praying, because I could look over on the hill and the trees were just swirling and swirling. So, I done some praying, for this wind to stop. And it did. So I was, God answers our prayers. But I don't mind to tell you. Yes, I was scared. I think we all were.
A lot of our fears are just unfounded. I fear silly things. What these disciples feared could kill them. This was real.
Yeah. Morning.
In the bottom of verse 37, Mark 4:37. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat. Here's the punchline. So that it was already filling. This lake is 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. Kind of in a valley in a way, and so they're out in the middle and that boat's filling. But they didn't have life.
No.
So they were in real great trouble with their physical being. And yet they were amazed that Jesus said, still. He was teaching them.
Yeah. Okay. As we move on here. We come on down here to chapter 5. After they have made it across the other side, and to the region of the Gerasenes, when they got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tomb with an unclean spirit met him. And what kind of strikes me is how quickly ones who were with Jesus, how quickly they abandoned him as he's walking up. And they all see these guys or guy coming towards them. They all turn them around. He didn't. So, that honestly, that speaks volumes of people's friendship, so to speak. Some will stick with you, some will leave you hanging.
The Sea of Galilee, had the opportunity to be there. It's about 26 miles, 26 miles if you're walking. Jerusalem, the Sea of Galilee. And when you come there, in Jesus' time, most of the habitation was on the left side of the lake. So when it says, chapter 4, they went to the other side. Chapter 5, it says, they came to the other side. In other words, they came back to the side Capernaum is. Now, first you see Capernaum, and as you go on down the left side of the lake, you come to this area called Dardanes, supposedly where the tombs were. This deranged man. Then you go on further, and they say this is where the outcropping. They're thinking that this is where Jesus preached to the multitude. Great sermon. But it's like, okay, they went to the other side, they crossed back to 8 miles to. You would think that that's really built up around the lake, but it's not. And if you consider where the lake was during Jesus' time, where it is now, it has lost most of its body of water. And like Capernaum, how big do you think Capernaum is? It's about the size of this city, the size of this church. It may include the school, but there's a rock wall around the city of Capernaum. And as when you go in from Jerusalem side, the first thing on the left is the synagogue. And across from that is the house of Peter. Now, the Catholic Church, they wouldn't let them build something. What they did is they built something over. And you would say, well, the main street, like in Jasper, you have a main street, you've got parking on side, you've got 4 lanes of traffic. No. The main street in Capernaum is no wider. I think it's less than what we see between the pews coming in this door. Really small, and that's it. That's right through. When it says they went to one side and then to the other side, the other side, when we were there, there was nothing, no one was living there. There were no roads over there. Because all the activities on this side of the lake.
So the only way to get there was either by boat or walk.
You know, when I was in Israel, they explained that because Jesus cursed that area and nothing grew up around the Lake of Galilee, it is pretty much the way it was before, because they didn't accept him. They had all this advantage to accept him, and so he cursed the area, and it has never, grown up and prospered and inhabited. It's pretty much like it was.
What do Americans think about demon possession? We've been programmed to not fear Satan. I watched a sermon this morning on YouTube, and when you get through with something on YouTube, you don't know what's going to come. But it was an interview with Tucker Carlson and John Rich, a country music singer. And they were talking politics, and I didn't have my remote. And then they were talking about Satanism. He was talking about Satanism. The Super Bowl was all about worshiping, the halftime, worshiping Satan. The videos and movies, Satan, seances, and all this stuff. And so John Rich said he was in his house in Nashville, and the Lord told him to write a song to counteract this stuff. And he's talking about how Daniel in Revelation gives us a lot of information. God gave him this song called Revelation. Gave him all the words, all the music in just a few minutes. And he said the Lord told him to make it big, to counteract all this stuff, and he did. He didn't know if anyone would listen to it, but it's gone to the top of the charts. I think the Lord is moving. I think we're going to see big changes right on the horizon now. So it'll be interesting to see.
I haven't watched it.
He made it real clear about the great controversy between Christ and Satan. Christ was here, Satan was here, and he was right in the middle, just like we are.
I've actually saw little clips of that interview, and he's actually talking about that the Schofield Study Bible and how that came about. The guy was following John Darby, who actually came up with the rapture theory. And so there's a whole interesting turn of events there. But I have saw parts of that interview.
Since you mentioned John Darby, maybe I'll tell you about a book I have. It's called The Incredible Cover-Up. And John Darby did not come up with this himself.
Can't help.
There was a lady by the name of Margaret MacDonald in Scotland, I think. I mean, MacDonald kind of tells you where it happened. And she had some, I guess you would call them seances or encounters with spirits. And they're the ones that gave Margaret MacDonald the idea of a secret rapture. And John Nelson Darby got it from her, and put it in his Bible, the Darby Bible. And then the Schofield Bible got it from the Darby Bible.
And what, you remember what the years were whenever all this was going on?
I believe it was 1833. I'd have to go home to make sure, but right around that time period, 32 to 34, but I think it was 1833 when it happened.
So it's about the time that we had the Great Awakening in the country.
Yeah. The Great Awakening of the early 1800s that happened in England and this country and various other places in Europe was going on at that time. And as you read this book, The Incredible Cover-Up, he points out that before that time, nobody had ever said anything except what the Bible teaches in terms of the literal second coming of Jesus Christ. Nobody had ever taught anything different.
Yeah.
But since 1833 is when this theory came up about the rapture. And then, of course, they, connected it to the prophecy of Daniel, where they took the last week of Daniel's prophecy and moved it to the end of time so that you have 3.5 years of tribulation, and then the Antichrist shows up, and then you have another 3.5 years before Jesus comes. And I'll just give you my opinion of that. That's blasphemy. Because if you leave the 1 week where it's supposed to be, who comes in the middle of the week? Jesus Christ comes in the middle of the week, the Messiah.
Yep.
So they move it to the end of the time, and in the middle of the week, they say the Antichrist shows up. Now, if that isn't blasphemy, I don't know what is.
Anyway, let's get back to our Sabbath School lesson here. We'll go here to Tuesday, and it says on the roller coaster with Jesus, and it says read Mark 5:21 through 24. What characteristics particularly stand out about Jairus? And I'm not liking where we're going here. We're kind of skipping over where these demons come out of where these tombs are at. And I want to back up and cover up. I want to work on those just a little bit because, like Roy said, people, they really don't understand, or they don't want to know about demon possession or having any interactions with demons. And I feel like that devil possession or demon possession, no matter, it can be in the form of drugs, people using drugs or whatever. I mean, but most people, they have to invite them in at some point.
Am I the only one that wonders why the demons wanted to go into the pigs? I mean, can't they sustain themselves without being inside a human or an animal? Am I the only one why they wanted to be in the pigs?
Well, I've wondered why they chose the pigs too, but
Well, they wanted to go into the pigs because they wanted to destroy the economy of that part of the country. And of course, I mean, I don't know, if the scripture tells us how many pigs were? 2,000. 2,000? That's a lot of money.
that's a lot
And
of-
they wanted to mess up the economy. They wanted to just devastate. And of course, that's what the devil's always interested in, is devastating people.
And
yeah.
I think God was in agreement with that. He wanted the pigs destroyed too.
Yes, and God has a way of turning things to his purpose. When Satan tries to do this, God turns it to his purpose. And if you don't mind me jumping beyond the lesson, which we'll get to probably in another week, the demon-possessed men are delivered and they want to go with Jesus.
Yeah.
And he tells them, no, go home and tell your friends what I've done for you. And then when you get over to chapter 6 and starting with verse 30, 31, and he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. And as you read this, I believe what had happened was, you have all this multitude of people coming to him, and there's the feeding of the 5,000. So I believe what happened was that the demoniacs, when they were delivered, they went home and they told their friends what had happened. In the meantime, Jesus, what do you have here? Jesus goes to Nazareth after he heals Jairus' daughter, and he sends out the 12, and then he comes back around to the other side of the lake, and that's where he feeds the 5,000. And I believe that is the result of what the demoniacs did in telling their friends. So even though Satan wanted to destroy the economy and turn the people against Jesus, God was able to turn that to his advantage.
Yeah.
Because as the demoniac said, this is what he did for us, the people realized that they had a great need beyond pigs.
Yeah.
And many of them turned to Jesus and came and listened to him. And that's when he fed the 5,000, latter part of chapter 6.
It was much more than 5,000. It was probably more like 20,000, because when you add the women and children, it was a great crowd.
Yeah.
Randy, you were talking about the demon-possessed person. Have any of you ever experienced something that that this was supernatural? That the hairs on the back of your head, hairs on your arm, you knew that this was not natural. I was in the military in '69 as an X-ray. I'm working in Fort Jackson, South Carolina. About that time, they had PCP was a big problem. So they brought this young soldier in. I don't think he weighed 140 pounds soaking wet. small in stature, small in size. So they strapped him down. I was X-ray tech at night. They wanted me there to take some X-ray, something inside of his body or something. So two big burly MPs were there. They had his arms strapped. You know, these straps, I'm sure you've seen them. And I'm telling you, these straps, very strong.
Yeah.
And so here he says, I'm there standing, I'm not right next to them. They're doing their thing, getting taken care of, mobilized. He says, you guys really think these straps are going to stop me? And one says, yeah, they're going to stop you. Well, look at this. So he raises compound fracture of both tib and fib on both legs, on bilateral wrist. I'm saying, holy Lord, a man of this size do this, knowing the damage that he's going to cause. I'm talking about 8 bones protruding through his skin, and he says, what do you think of that? And he wasn't complaining. I'm telling you, folks, there are evil spirits in this world. I mean, I've got goosebumps as I'm thinking about it, recalling it 50 years ago. You think, well, there's no damn. I've never seen people in them. Just didn't.
Well, I think a lot of it is we just don't. We see things, and people don't recognize what they're seeing. They don't recognize what it is. They think it's normal for people to be like that. You know, if they're on drugs or something, they think that's normal behavior for somebody on drugs. Well, it's not really. Maybe the drugs do have an effect, but anytime I think that we open ourselves up to that, we are opening ourselves up for those demons to come in.
For a person 140 pounds in a flat position to raise himself up and break 8 long bones, no way. There had to be some devil possession going.
Yeah. And, you know, you recognize it for what it is, what it was.
Beyond physical capability for
Yeah.
a person of that size.
But now, the other people that were in the room with you, what was their reaction? I mean, I'm sure they were amazed.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I did my job and I got out. Because it was physically impossible for someone to do that. For him to not feel the pain of that. 8 bones, compound, bones, fragments sticking out.
Yeah.
I'm just glad there's God and Jesus. He says, peace be still.
So, you know, and then he wanted to go, the man there, he wanted to go with Jesus. But like Elder Hickson says, it was better for him to stay there than to go back across with him, because he was, all the people, even though the ones who had lost the pigs, and they didn't want Jesus there anymore, because yes, like you said, they had lost a lot of money. And then the fear factor takes over. But they knew this guy. He had been there all this time. They knew him. So he was actually able to go and witness to the surrounding people. And you're talking about whenever the multitudes there for the feeding of the 5,000. I agree with you. That's where most of those folks come from. They had heard about the miracles that Jesus had performed.
Wasn't it 3 years later that Jesus came back? In other words, this witness, the demoniac he witnessed, I think, for 3 years, and he prepared the soil in that area, and then Jesus came back. Wasn't it 3 years later Jesus came back to the same area?
Oh, it was not nearly 3 years.
How long
It
was
may
it?
have been a few months.
3 months then?
Yeah. Go to the SD Bible commentary and look in the volume that has to do with the New Testament. And you will find in the front maps that give Jesus was here, Jesus was here, Jesus was here, Jesus was here, and then here. And when you look at those maps and realize where Jesus went next and next and next and next, it couldn't have been more than a few months from the time that he healed the demoniacs till the time that he came back.
Well, anyway, he prepared the soil. Now, there were 2 of them healed, and apparently he was a lot more vocal than the other one, because Mark probably heard this story secondhand. He wasn't there, so he never mentioned the second one, too. In the other Gospels, they mentioned 2.
Matthew mentions 2, Luke mentions 1, Mark mentions 1, and Ellen White mentions 2.
There were probably 2 then.
But before we get to the part that interests me about what you were saying, Elder Hickson, is where they go on their missionary journey and then they come back, and this crowd is following them, and where Jesus, the disciples are saying, send them away, that they can go find them something to eat. And Jesus tells the disciples to feed them. And I don't know how the rest of y'all feel about this, but he's telling the disciples, feed them. And they're like, we don't have, this is all we've got. We've got a few fish and we've got this. But I believe he's telling them, you can do this yourself. If he had sent them out, he had empowered them. And I believe if they had had the faith that they could have blessed this food themselves, they could have fed them. I believe it was another weak moment.
Randy, let me add that in Matthew 28:19, Jesus, in his words, he says, go. But here in Mark 5, verse 19, he's talking one-on-one, and here is a synopsis of what God, through Jesus, has told us what to do with evangelism. Go home to your friends. Tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has compassion on you. There is a blueprint right there by the words of Jesus. Go to your friends.
I agree with you. That is I think that's a lot. We see, we've seen TV, we've heard stories of missionaries or whatever going off on great adventures into faraway lands in the dark of Africa or wherever. But we have a missionary field right out here. And that's a sad thing that most of us will never go into that field for whatever reason. We are either intimidated to work around home, or we just don't feel like that of any value. I don't know what the problem is. But you know, there's a field right out here that we could work. That one.
What I was saying was, could that be the result that we don't know how to work with people?
Yeah,
Or-
probably a lot of it.
I come from a background where there's such strong fellowship among relationships among the church members. And I'm going back to last weekend. I was up in Michigan and for a funeral. And I was talking to, before I left, I was talking to Pastor Glenn over at the Calvary Church. And I was explaining to him, you know, you hear about small groups and churches and so on and so forth. You didn't hear about that back when I lived in Berrien Springs, but we had a group of friends that was so tight that when Doug passed away, we came out of Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, California, all around the country to come to a funeral of someone that we cared about that much. And when you have that kind of relationship going on, it not only do you develop that, but other people want to be a part of that. Where if people don't really know one another and they don't really associate together and they don't do anything, there's no drawing card there. And we need to learn to do that, to develop those kind of relationships so that when you invite someone and they come, they know they're well accepted. They know, and I don't mean face, you know, on the surface, because it's easy to do that on the surface. I'm talking about long term, where people know that they're accepted, they're loved, and they just want them to be a part of the family, if you will. And I think that's missing in a lot of our churches.
I think it's probably missing in a lot of our churches, but I think you're probably right too. Is, you know, we get in these little groups, so to speak, and we just don't never branch out.
Correct.
And you know, if you're not in the group, you're on the outside. You know, and we a lot of times. We in the group, we forget about the people on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
We forget how to go pull people from the outside into the group. Or we get to a point that we just, well.
Coming from a nursing background, we had to learn to be able to build relationships with people. I've trained nurses, and in the process of doing that, I explained to them, you've got just a couple minutes to be able to walk in a room and get that patient that you have to know, like, and trust you. You've got to do it just like that. And I have been places, and I did travel nursing at that, but I have been places where I have seen patients and they've come up to me later on. And one in particular I'm thinking of right now, and she passed away, but right before she passed, I didn't have her as a patient that night. But I stopped to see her because I'd had her off and on for over a year. And I stopped in to see her, and the first thing I did when I walk in the room, she throws her arms up to try to give me a hug. And then she passed away that day. It saddened. But that's the kind of relationships we have. It's the same way with nurses. In fact, I ran into your niece the other day. I hadn't seen her in years, but you know, Janetta's like a sister to me. We're tight, and the reason we're tight is because we've spent a lot of time together experiencing things. And that's what we have to learn to do, not only within the church, but within others, and invite them in and make them a part of it.
Yeah. Agree. let's,
So I need to correct something. I was speaking of the feeding the 5,000 as happening in Decapolis. That is not correct. I remembered that I have in the back of this Bible is a harmony of the Gospels, which outlines chronologically every passage in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so I turned to that and got looking at it. And the feeding of 5,000 happened somewhere around Bethsaida. It's the feeding of the 4,000 that happened, and it's in Mark 8, 1-9. And that happened in Decapolis. So I'm just correcting myself that
okay.
Jesus later came around to Decapolis again. It was probably a few months, but he came back to the east side of the lake, and that's where the feeding of the 4,000 took place, which was a result of the demoniac's witness. What I just said, no, I wasn't saying that. I'm just saying that I was suggesting that the feeding of the 5,000 was in Decapolis, and that was incorrect. The feeding of the 4,000 was in Decapolis. The feeding of the 5,000 was somewhere around Bethsaida. Right. Right, the Gadarenes. And there's another word that I think maybe the old King James uses, and that is the Gergesenes. So both are basically the same term.
Just depends on what part of the world you're from, how you pronounce it. Okay. All right, let's move on here to Thursday's lesson. It says a different kind of Messiah, and it says read Mark 6, 34 through 52. What was the problem Jesus and his disciples confronted, and how was it solved? And says after the disciples return from their mission, they go with Jesus to the remote area on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee to rest. But a large crowd of 5,000 people arrives at the location before them. Jesus sees that they are like sheep without a shepherd. He teaches them the entire day. In the evening, the disciples recommend sending the crowd away to find food, but Jesus tells them to feed the crowd. The ensuing dialogue in Mark 6, 35 through 38 illustrates that the disciples were thinking in human terms about how to solve the problem. However, Jesus resolves the problem by miraculously feeding the large crowd with just 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Characteristics of this story play into the popular concept of a Messiah in Jesus' day. The exception was that the Messiah would liberate Israel from its enemies and would bring in righteousness and peace. A large number of men in the desert setting would carry with a military overtones in revolt. This notion was strengthened by the references to Jesus seeing the people like sheep without a shepherd. A particular quotation from Numbers 27:17, where Moses asked God to appoint a leader for Israel after him. This phraseology about the shepherd for God's people appears elsewhere in the Old Testament, typically in reference to Israel's lack of a leader or king. And we have some, it says compare 1 Kings 27 or 22, 17, 2 Corinthians 18, 16, and Ezekiel 34, 5 and 6. Yet Jesus does not meet our false expectation. Instead, he sends his disciples away and dismisses the crowd, and rather than lead a rebellion against Rome, what does he do? He retreats to a mountain to pray. Not what the people were expecting. In place of the popular view of the Messiah as a king who liberates Israel, he comes to liberate people from the bondage of sin. His walking on the water, displays to the disciples that he is indeed the Lord of nature. But he does not come to rule, but to give his life as a ransom. And then here at the bottom it says, what should this story tell us about why a correct understanding of prophecy is important, or a false understanding of Christ's first coming led to a disaster for some? How much more so could a false understanding do the same for some in regard to his second? So, I think, if we go back here and like it says, if we think about it, they were looking for somebody to overthrow the Romans. They weren't really looking for somebody to save them from their sins. And, it just seems like all these stories that we read and where God is working with people and Jesus is trying to save people, and all this is stuff that they should have known. But it's like, he does something for them. And then you read it just a little further, and it's like 20 minutes later, they forgot everything what they just went through. It's just like, they crossed the Red Sea. And they're out on the other side. And then, I'm not sure how long it was between this, but it seems like people just have a real short memory of what's happened, the miracles that God has performed in their lives. Okay. On Friday, there's further thought, and it says, read Ellen White, Peace Be Still, kill some pages there. And all who are under the training of God is to be revealed a life that is not in harmony with the world. Its custom or its practice. And everyone needs to have a personal experience in obtaining a knowledge of the will of God. We must individually hear him speaking to our heart. When every other voice is hushed, and in the quietness we wait before silence of the soul makes more distinct a voice of God. He bids us, be still and know that I am God. Psalms 46:10. Here alone can true rest be found. And this is the effectual preparation for all who labor for God, amid the hurrying, throng, and strain of life's intense activities. The soul that is thus refreshed will be surrounded with the atmosphere of light and peace. The life will breathe out fragrance and will reveal a divine power that will reach man's heart. This comes from the Desire of Ages, 360.
We kind of skipped over Jairus and
Yes, we did.
the lady with the issue of blood. But there's just some interesting details there. Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue.
Yep.
A person who had an issue of blood, a woman who had an issue of blood, was not permitted to go into the synagogue. And so the ruler of the synagogue was kind of instrumental in, quotes, policing that. Jairus had a 12-year-old girl who was about to die. This woman had been excluded from the synagogue for 12 years. And so Jesus lets himself be interrupted to bring deliverance to a woman so she could go to the synagogue and worship. And I believe it made a huge impact in Jairus' life to realize that God was delivering somebody to be able to go and worship again. And this man who had kept her from worship was kept from seeing his daughter live because she died before they got there. And then Jesus went and delivered his daughter. And so there's just some interesting things going on there, that it was 12 years for the daughter, 12 years for the woman. He was the ruler of the synagogue. She was not permitted to go to the synagogue, but Jesus brought deliverance to them all. The woman, the ruler, and his daughter.
Yep. Yeah, and what's interesting too about that, where he had meant to raise the daughter back to life, is when he got there, and all the folks in the house were wailing and crying and everything, and he's like, why are you doing this? But what's interesting is he puts them all out of the house, and he takes just those who were with him, mother and the father, goes in the child. Which brings up another interesting thing. It says the ones who were with him. So we assume that would be the disciples, right? But what about this lady that had touched Jesus' garment? She was following along with the crowd. She permitted to come into the house too? She wanted that were allowed to go in the room? We don't know. Food for thought.
We think that things just happen and that's the way it is. Like Pastor Hickson said, he was the ruler of the synagogue.
Yeah.
In other words, he was the high priest of the synagogue.
Yep.
So many facets when you just read just 10 or 12 texts, and it's there.
Yeah.
Dig a little.
Jairus was really humbled by that experience. About his love for his daughter. Maybe.
You know, we've all had opportunities to witness, and one of the beliefs that we have is a state of the dead.
Yep.
Well, when you start discussing the state of the dead in our viewpoint versus their viewpoint, they bring up, well, even Jesus said she wasn't dead, she was sleeping. So how do you defend that. When a person is dead, they're dead. He says they're sleeping. There and again, you have to dig a little deeper and have the text to support your point of view.
Yep. Yep. The, on the clock there is 10:30. So I'm gonna go with a couple more of these questions here. It's, and that says, how would you respond if someone asked you, what has Jesus freed you from? And it says, discuss why it is that God sometimes allows a good person, such as John the Baptist, to be placed in prison and to be executed. What solace or hope can we find despite these different things? What lessons are there in the feeding of the 5,000 for a church congregation with a few resources? And it says also, compare popular views of Jesus' day with a picture of him in Mark 5 and 6. That is, what about those who use Jesus to seek political power and dominate others? Those are just questions to ponder. So, anyway, we look like we are out of time. So, Wayne, would you mind closing?
Father in heaven, we just want to thank you so much for this Sabbath day, that a day that we can come apart and spend time worshiping you, a day that we can join together in studying your word. And Father, I just pray that you will come into our hearts and our minds, help us to understand more of these things that you have for us. Pray that you'll be with us now as we go into the main service, and bless each one there and bring us back together again. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay.
Morning.
Yeah.
Good morning. See you.
Keep playing, because I don't know who's doing something.